Rabbi, welcome back to Yerushalmi Terumot. Now, just a reminder, by the way, those who are following the 5 3/4 year cycle, we are a bit early. So I apologise for that. The official cycle doesn't start for another 2 weeks or so, but we are starting a bit early. We will be learning Yerushalmi Terumot. It talks about, of course, Hafroshas, Truma, and Maestros, where the obligations are, the mitzvah, the bracha, when it has to be done, what is the shiur of Truma and Maaseh, what about the idea of the food being near you at the time, chiyuv, p'tur for chiyuv, how to choose the best produce to take Truma and Maaseh, of course the Isur to Yisraelim and Levim, the heter for Kohenim and their households, the mitzvah of eating, dealing of Tumah and Shmira, how you have to guard the Truma, what happens if you use the Truma for non-Truma things and payments which are required. Okay, those are the various points which we will discuss in the course of this Masechet. The shir is the Ilui Nishmas Moshe Ezra ben Rachel, who was the Chazan in Od Yosef Chai in London, who unfortunately passed away today. He was the famous Chazan there for many years. Truly be missed. Okay, we are up to Perishon Halacha Aleph. Okay, Chamisha, we're starting off with the laws of Hafroshas Truma, right? We start with when people who are not suitable to be Mafresh Truma. So where we go? Chamisha La Yisrael. 5 people should not take Truma. If they did, it's not valid. It's not Chal, even B'di'eved. Right? There are Tanaim who argue on some of these points. The Mishnah is stressing it doesn't help. If they take Truma, it doesn't help. Right? Don't say it's a mistake. Yeah, there are people who argue on some points, but the Mishnah opinion holds it doesn't help. And who are they? Let's see. HaCheresh. And we'll have a discussion on that in the Gemara as well. What sort of Cheresh are we talking about? Usually, Cheresh, of course, is somebody who can't speak and can't hear. We'll have to see what it means here. But HaShaita, and someone who is a fool, but HaKatan, and a child, one who takes Truma for produce which is not his without permission of the owners. And also, a Gentile who takes Truma on fruit of the Jewish-owned produce, even with the permission of the Jew. In all these cases, a Truma. The Truma is not valid. Right? Okay. Okay, it doesn't go. Now, whether the wording here, it says that we're learning all of them, all of these 5 cases, Ein Truvas and Truma. Okay. Some have guessed that Ein Trumasoi Truma, which seems to imply it's about the last case. We're learning going on all of them. Anyway, let's see now. Chesh Hamadaber Be'ena Shomea. Now, so the deaf mute who can speak but can't hear, Lo Yisrael, he shouldn't take Truma, but Be'im Taram, if he did take Truma, the Truma is valid. He has das. He's considered a clever person. Ideally, he should not take Truma. Why? Because he cannot hear the bracha that he is making on the separation. Whereas Cheresh Shedibru Chachamim B'chol Mochaim, the Cheresh that's normally referred to, where it doesn't help even B'di'eved, like when we said the Truma is not valid, that's She'ena Lo Shemea B'lo B'daber. He cannot speak and cannot hear. That Cheresh, we consider him to have no das, and he, therefore, if he took Truma, it's not valid. Now, there are other opinions about a child. A child who has not yet shown 2 signs of maturity, that's 2 hairs, pubic hairs. Rabbi Yehuda said Truma. He says the Truma is valid, because according to Rabbi Yehuda, any child can take Truma, right? So it's any child, basically, is valid for taking Truma. Some say even Rabbi Yehuda requires Higia Lechinuch, that they've reached an age where you can educate them. Maybe 6, 7 or something like that. So that's how some want to say. Alright. So Rabbi Yehuda and Truma say Truma. Rabbi Yossi said, if this child who separated Truma has not yet reached the age of being able to make vows. Now, what is the age for vows? For a boy it's 12, and for a girl it's 11. So if they've not reached that age, then Ein Truma, then Truma is not working. However, when they reach that age, so a boy being 12, then Truma, then the Truma is a Truma. Because it's Chal, through a person's speech, and it's chal even at that age. So for a boy it would be 12. Okay, they're learning he's got who's this? This is Rabbi Yossi, who says it's got a din of Nadarim. Right? There is a view actually of Rav Meir that even a child who's 12 can't take truma. And that really is like the Tanakh in our Mishnah. That a normal child can't take truma. There's no distinction at all. Everyone agrees that we shouldn't allow a child to take truma. Okay? And most paskin like Rabbi Yossi, that if the boy is 12, the truma is valid. The God held like the halachas Rabbi Meir that any child is not effective. So there we go. Okay. Hamisha lo Yisrael. 5 people should not take truma. Rosh Shmuel bar Nachman, Shamal Kulai. He learned from all of these that the truma is not effective. Min hacha, from this passage. It says, Dabar b'nei Yisrael, v'yichul li truma. They should take truma for me. Right? And the passage continues. From every person who will be generous, you'll take my truma. Yeah. Prat the guy. To exclude a guy can't be a shliach of a Jewish person to separate truma from his fruit. So a guy who separates truma from his own truma, from his own fruit, it can be valid. You'll see that. Okay. Me'ez kalish, pera lekatan. To exclude a child, he's not considered a man. Asher yidzvenu livai, pera lecheresh l'shaita. This excludes the deaf, mute, and the fool. They do not have a knowledge, they do not have a heart or a willingness, at least an understanding, in order to donate. Okay? We're not excluding them from the word ish. So we're excluding from this, yidvenu liba. It's a reference to their heart to understand what's happening. And then, v'zaisa truma shetikhu me'itam. This is a truma you should take. Parat l'tayim she'nishal. To exclude someone who takes truma on produce which is not his. Right? Of course, you can't be makdish, you can't make something hektish, you can't sell something that's not yours. We have an extra dasha, you can't take truma on fruit which is not yours. You might say, well, look, since it's tebel, as if, there's already truma in there. You're just separating the truma, because anyway, the truma needs to be separated out. So you might have thought, well, anyone can take truma even though it's not your fruit. So we say, no, you can't take truma on something which is not yours. Okay. Now we said the deaf mute and the fool, they do not have das to have in mind to do a proper separation from truma. So now, it's all very well what they're doing, they don't have das, but they're doing an action here. By doing an action, that should substantiate what they are doing to make it effective. So v'yechiach ma'aseh shelahen al machshavtam. Let their actions for separating truma have an effect on their thoughts. The fact that, and maybe they did have the right intentions for the sake of truma. Through their actions, we should use that. So tanin and tama. And we've learnt in machshirim. Now, machshirim talks about liquids which are fruit which becomes susceptible to receive tumah. And it only receives tumah if it became wet, right? With liquids willingly, with the willingness of the owners. Okay? So now, imagine the deaf mute or the child takes fruit to the roof. Why are you taking it up to the roof? You don't need to get wormy, and dew falls on it. Now, even though this deaf mute or the child had intention, after he put this fruit on the roof, he wants the dew to fall on them. The fruit is not yet muksha, it's not susceptible to receive tumah. Why? The deaf mute, yes, there's an action they've done. We can understand their knowledge and their willingness and their intention from their action, but we don't have the required thought, right? And a thought without an action doesn't help. So this fruit, the fact that the kavanah, that the fruit should become wet, is not going to be mashir the peros. Now, what action is there that could be a proof that they really want it to be susceptible to receive tumah? What action would we say is a valid action? If they are holding on to the fruit at the time when the dew falls, and they take it up to the roof in order for it to get wet, then the actions prove that they really want the falling of the dew onto the fruit. Okay? So by having the holding onto it and taking it into the dew, yes, we know they want it to get wet. So you see from this Mishnah, when they do an action where we can see the thought coming through, then that thought is effective. And we bring another raya, that an action of a cheresh or shaita can, by looking at the action, that can tell you what the thought is. Or Tanila Tama, we've also learned that this is with waters of a river, which don't make fruit susceptible to receive Tama, unless the fruit was detached, unless the water was detached from the river with the willingness of the owner. So he says, Hayrida, Chayrish Shoyt V'Katan, let's say the deaf mute brings the animal to the river to drink, Afa Bisha Chishev, even though he has the intention, Sheyudchu Ragleha, that the animal's legs should become wet, and if afterwards that water comes from the legs onto fruit, Eina V'Chiyuta, that water does not make that fruit susceptible to receive Tumah. They're not considered as if they've come detached from the river with their willingness. Because the deaf mute, yesh lehem maaseh, yes, we have an action, but ein lehem machshava. We don't have the thought behind it. Right? Their thought doesn't help. The thought on its own, we don't really have the action helping the thought. So what would be an action which would consider this water detached from the river with their willingness, where the deaf mute rubs the feet of the animal in water. Through that action, he's showing he wants to wash them with water. Now, from this mission again, we see when they do an action where it's noticeable what the thought is, then that thought helps. You understand? So the action can support the thought. If the action helps us to understand what the thought is, then it helps. So by him rubbing the legs of the animal with water, you show that you're happy for the water to become detached onto the animal, and if it goes onto fruit, it will make the fruit susceptible to receive tumah. So we say that over there. So the question is, why don't we say it here? We should say the same thing. When they separate truma, their action should make us understand on their thought, that their intention is they are separating for the sake of truma. Because they're doing a whole action, right? They're separating this fruit away from the other fruit. So Rav Shmuel, Rav Bava, B'Shem Rav Yechon, and Rav Zira, B'Shem Rabbanim. He says with truma, it says, "V'nachshav lachem teru maschem." The pasuk continues, "Kandagam menagem chamnem meneyachem." The truma will be thought to you like your truma, a reference of machshava. Now we say like this: Es shekasa by machshava. When the Torah refers to thought, ein maaseh shalai meichiach al machshavtai. Then action cannot help to tell you what the thought is. The thought has to be sufficient without any action. The thought has to be enough. When the Torah refers to thought, then the thought has to be enough without anything else. As she'ein kasa by machshava, where there's no reference to thought, then maaseh shalai, then the action meichiach al machshavtai can tell you what the thought is. They can. And here, when it comes to separating truma, however, kasa by machshava, since there's a lashon of thought, right, the nachshav, lashon machshava, there's a reference to thought, you cannot rely on action to help you to understand the thought. Ein maaseh shalai meichiach al machshavtai. The action cannot help you with the thought. Right, where the main inyan is through action, and the thought is a tanai, a consequential tanai, like Hashras Ra'im, where the main Hashra is through putting the water, it's going to be with a willingness, then Machshava helps when it's noticeable from the action. But where the main thought is, the main thing is the Machshava, the Nachshav, then it doesn't help a Machshava, even though you've got an action supporting it. At the end of the day, it's not a proper Machshava. It's not like a clever person's Machshava. Okay?
And I would assume that a cotton called Rabbi that his Machshava is the Machshava.
Yeah, what Rabbi Yehuda said, what, every child is okay?
Yeah, even the Cohen there was not.
Yeah.
He's saying the Machshava of a child is.
He's got machshava is enough, maybe, or his machshava. Amar Rav Yossi. Rav Yossi said, Kumishma. Rav Yossi said, Rav Yossi, Kashai Kumishma. I asked it before Shema. Hare Giti. Now, what about a get? It's got to be written for the sake of the woman who's being divorced. Hare Ein Kosabeh Machshava. There's no reference to thought there. Nevertheless, we find with the get, Ein Masa Shlo, deaf mute, his action, I'm afraid doesn't help. Ein Masa Shlo Mechiach HaMachshavta doesn't help his thought. It's a nida. We've learned in Gita, and Akal Kshay Liftos like get. Everyone is kosher to write the get. I feel Chesed it's because but Rav Huda said, who? When can a deaf mute write a get? Providing she hey pikeach ayman al-gavo. There's a clever person standing next to him. And since the clever person is telling him to write the get for the sake of this woman who's being divorced, and he does it without any thought of his own, his writing is considered is for the sake of that person that the clever person commanded, and the get is kosher. You hear that? So when the cheresh becomes the deaf mute writes the get, he's following the instruction of the clever person next to him. The clever person says, please write the get with the intention for this woman who's being divorced. And when the deaf mute goes ahead and writes it, we say he's following that instruction that he's been given. What? Or it's written down for him and he can see it. Right? Okay? So now, he's following the instruction, and we say there's no reference to machshava, and Master doesn't help, and the only reason why it helps is because the Bikach is standing next to him. Rabbi Yochanan asked on this, how can we allow a get where a deaf mute wrote it, even if a clever person standing next to him? Because it says the husband shall write a book of cutting off, a book of krisus, and la, we learn it again, has to be written lishma for the sake of the woman being divorced. If someone has no knowledge, he can't have kavod to write lishma. How does it help when a clever person is standing next to him? So Rabbi Yochanan concludes, the Mishnah is telling you the cheresh can only write the normal wording. It was on this day, bracket for date. You can't write the important parts of the get. That's the standard wording. The normal nusach that you'll find, not the date, not the names. The normal wording. But the Tyref, which is the main part of the get with all the names, has to be the Shema. This person is not good enough. You need a proper bendas to write it. Now, obviously, he's writing the names and the place properly. His masim, his actions are showing you he has intention to write for the sake of this get. And yet, Rav Yochanan says the get is possible. Why? You see, with Gittin, you can't rely on his Maisa to show you that there was a Kavanah here. You need a Kavanah which is clear Kavanah. Now, the Torah never referenced the expression of thought. And yet, still we say that I'm afraid Maisa is not enough. You need more than that. You can't just rely on the action alone, even though there's no reference to thought. And this goes against that which Rabbi Yochanan said before, that Truma, when there's reference to Machshava, you can't rely on the action. So Rabbi Yossi comes and answers the question. Chazra Rabbi Yossi. Rabbi Yossi answers back. But he says like this. Tamar, in Gittin, Zeh Kaisev, Zeh Megarish. The Cheresh writes, and the husband is the one who's doing divorce. And since you're not concluding the Maisa through the Cheresh, he doesn't really think about it. He doesn't put his knowledge on it. He's just writing something. It's not his get. He's not divorcing anyone with it. And even though there's no reference to Machshava, his thoughts don't help. Because he's not putting his mind to it, really. He's just writing exercise, right? And the husband's using it for a get. So I'm afraid in such a case, even though there's no reference to Machshava, his thought doesn't help. It doesn't tell us anything about his true kavanah. But as far as Truma is concerned, Hu Choshev, he is the one having the thought, this deaf mute, Hu Tareh, and he is the one doing the separating of the Truma. And since his action is completed through him, he puts more mind on it. And his actions show us a proper kavanah. And because the Torah required Machshava with Hafrashas Truma, that's why the actions doesn't help. You understand? It should help. that because the Torah went out of its way to put reference to machshava, means machshava on its own has to help. We can't rely on the action to support it. Rabbi Yaakov Baracha, he said, Ilu Kasav. So he's saying the same answer but slightly different wording. Ilu Kasav, who? Look, if he'd written the get himself, Begiresh who, and he divorced his wife, get who, it would be a valid get. And his action is concluded through him. And therefore his actions help to tell us what his kavanah was. But if he's writing a get for someone else, then it's not the action completed through him, then his actions don't help to tell us what his kavanah is. But here in the case of Truma, Hu Chayshif, the deaf mute is having the thought. But Hu Tyrem, and he is the one taking Truma. Therefore, had the Torah not told me that there's a reference to thought with separating Truma, you might have said we could rely on his action to tell us what his thought is. Now we learned in the Mishnah, Cheshet v'katan who take Truma, their Truma is not Truma. And it just says stuff. It sounds like in every situation, they take Truma as no good. Rabbi Yaakov Baracha, Rabbi Yochanan, there are Tanaim Chalukin ala Shonezeh. There are people who argue on this opinion. They say there are cases where they take Truma, if let's say a clever person standing next to them, whatever. Malkadu, what's Rabbi Yochanan telling us? And who is the one who's arguing on our Mishnah? Ask yet Rabbi Yochanan the Trumas. Rabbi Yochanan, and Trumas is like Yishmael, the son of Rabbi Yochanan Broka, in Kiddushin. So Rabbi Yochanan here with Mishnah and Trumas is like the view of Rabbi Yishmael as far as Kiddushin. Now Kiddushin, Pashtus we're learning, is taking the water of the red heifer. Right? The Kiddush Mechatas. Others learn differently, but we're going to learn that from. So when Rabbi Yochanan said that some people argue in our Mishnah, he meant Rabbi Yishmael, the son of Rabbi Yochanan Broka, who said that Cheshos v'katan, who poured the water for the Mechatas, where a clever person is standing next to them, their actions help. And the same thing also with Truma. If they take Truma when a clever person is standing there, the Truma is valid. You hear that? So therefore these people who say it is valid is like this Rabbi Yochanan who said it's valid to have someone else standing there when they're pouring this water for the red heifer. But Rabbi Yochanan Begittin, Rabbi Yochanan in Gittin, who said it doesn't help even if a clever person standing there, that is Karabonah de Kiddushin. That's like the Chachamim who argue on Rabbi Yishmael, the son of Rabbi Yochanan Broka, as far as pouring the water with the Mechatas. According to them, the deeds of Chesed v'Katan don't help, even if a clever person standing next to them. I will bring this back like this here about taking the water of the Mechatas to Tani. We learned in the Brisa, Chesed v'Katan Shekidshu. They were sanctifying this Mechatas water with the ashes. Ein Kiddushin is not effective. Rabbi Yishmael ben Oshem, he said, Beina and Bein Azman, if they do it on their own, is not effective. But Beina and Bein Acherin, if there's a clever person watching, then Kiddushin then is valid. So Rabbi Yishmael holds that the deeds of a Chesed where the clever person standing there help. But the Chachamim hold the deeds doesn't help, even if there is a Pekeach, even if there's a clever person watching what's going on. Now we bring a Brisa. And it talks about someone who was all there and then became a cheresh. Tani learned in Brisa. Cheresh Harav, the deaf mute takes Truma, it doesn't work. Ain't Truma is Truma. Harav Shemi Gabriel, but when is that? The Shaya Cheresh with Chilasid, when he was a cheresh from the beginning. But it might be keach with his cheresh, if he was fine and then became a cheresh. He can take Truma, but Kaisev and write to others what he's done. Other people can validate his signature, and we then that should be good enough, and we'll treat it with laws of Truma. So he says here, somehow he gets a kaisev. Through the writing, he's got das. We see that he has das. Some say he takes Truma and the others fulfill what he's done. Other people are Mekayim it, they're standing next to him. That's how someone to learn. Okay, so what have we got here? So when I remember Cheresh with Chilasan, maybe Kach with his Cheresh, then it does work, it can still work. Rabbi Yaakov Baracha, Rabbi Yochanan, Chalukin ala Shana Zeh. There's some who argue on this Tanu who learn this din. That's from Shim Gamliel. They hold if he's a cheresh, I'm afraid it doesn't help. He's got a din of cheresh. He can't take trauma at all. Then why does Rav Yechon tell us? Some people argue. Amrin, they said, well, what's this pliga? And Mishnah, which we're going to bring, in Yevamos, clearly argues on the view of Shim Gamliel. The Mishnah says, if at the time of Kiddushin, the husband and wife were all normal, and then this Hareshu, the husband became this deaf mute, or Nishta, or this fool, well, he can't divorce her now. Right? He's not got das anymore, so he can't divorce her. He had a proper wedding, now he's got no das, he can't divorce her. Now, according to Shim Gamliel, since he was Bikach from the beginning, then therefore, Yichtav, he can write that he wants to give a get, so the other others will fulfill his wishes. Why does the Mishnah say he can't get rid of her forever? It must be this Mishnah argues on Shim Gamliel and holds that although he was Bikach from the beginning, then he became a deaf mute. He can't start writing to give a get in any way. Since this Mishnah clearly argues on Shim Gamliel, so why is Rav Yechon telling me, oh, some people argue on Shim Gamliel? Of course there are people arguing on Shim Gamliel. So the Gemara answers, Chaim Mune, we could explain the Mishnah in a case, where the deaf mute doesn't know how to write. Therefore the Mishnah didn't suggest let him write and others will fulfill his words, because he doesn't know how to write. But in a case where he knows how to write, could be the Mishnah would agree to Shim Gamliel that he can write it and other people fulfill his wishes. Now the Gemara brings another question. We have a brisa which clearly argues on Shim Gamliel. It says in the brisa, a husband writes a get. And he says, through his writing, the sofa to the scribe, he writes that the sofa, the scribe should write and the witnesses should sign a get for his wife. After when they write the get and they sign it, but they give it to him, the husband and he gives it to her, ain't a get, is not a valid get. Right? He's written, it seems he can't command with his mouth. Maybe he's written it down, maybe it's a cherish of some kind. He's writing it, so he was obviously clever in the beginning, then he became a cherish, and the Brisa tells me that I'm afraid the writing does not help. And that is not like Yerushalmi Gamliel. Rabbi Yosef says, we'll look at the end of the Brisa. The less he pliga, you'll see it's not arguing on Yerushalmi Gamliel. The Brisa continues, Eina get Achi Yishmael is kolai. It's not a get till they hear the voice of the husband, Shamal Sofer, who tells the scribe, Kasoim to write, the La'edim Chasoim, the Edim to sign. Until he's healthy enough and he can command the witnesses with his mouth. Now surely, Laisa Dava, you don't really need Achi Yishmael is kolai, they actually hear his voice. And I feel hear Kibarosh, if he nods with his head in front of the witnesses to hint to them that he wants to do a get, they can write based on that. Why does the Brisa say they have to hear his voice? Must be, as Amar less can, you have to say there's no proper, this is not the proper wording of this Brisa. But therefore it could be the same thing in the first part of the Brisa, less can. We don't have the exact wording as to what was said. We can't prove from here anything as far as the din of a Bikeach who became a deaf mute and so on, because we don't have the proper wording here. Amar Rabbana said, no, it is can. We have the right wording. The Brisa, the Sefer, everything's right. He shmiya sakol, he hakol sarosh. There's no difference between hearing something or nodding one's head. And therefore it helps to tell you what his command is. And the Brisa says until he hears his voice, it means until he hears his voice or until he nods his head. Rav Zeira Baikum Rabbana, he said, wait a minute. Kamada Temana, you can't tell me with nodding the head, nodding the head only helps after 3 times. Right? But hearing him, you don't need that 3 times. You think you have to hear his voice 3 times to check that he's saying what is right? He has to say it 3 times. So the wording, there's obviously differences in the wording because hearing the voice is not the same as nodding the head. So he answered, I don't mean that hearing the voice and nodding are exactly the same. Of course there's differences. Ishmiya Sakal, for hearing him say it, once is enough. Hakana Sabash, nodding the head, you need it 3 times. So after he nodded 3 times, as if he clearly commanded it. It comes up, according to Ramona, that the Gersa of the Brisa is correct. So the question comes back. You see from this Brisa, he argues on Shum Gamliel, who holds that writing of a Bikach who became a deaf mute helped. And why does Rabbi Yochanan have to tell me that some argue on Shum Gamliel when clearly there seems to be a Brisa that argues? Rav Yudin said, we could say that the Brisa is not arguing on Shum Gamliel. Tama, in the din of Shum Gamliel, the Omer is where a person says in his writing, Kach or Kach or Sisi. This is what. So the din of Shum Gamliel is where he says, I've done it. I've separated Truma. And therefore his writing helps. Whereas Hacha here in the Brisa is talking about Behu Omer, where he tells in his writing to others, Kach v'kach asu, please go, so you shall do. You shall write, you shall sign the get. In this situation, even Shum Gamliel agrees, the writing does not help. You hear that? So there's a difference between when he says he wrote that he did it, or when he writes, please go and do. And please go and do is not good enough. That's not going to help. When he says, I did it, that's when it's going to help. Rabbi Yochanan bar Levi boy, he asked, Im yesh boy, das, if he has knowledge, l'she'ava, for things in the past, he can write about things with the things which happened in the past, yesh boy das, now boy should have knowledge for the future. I mean, ein boy das l'she'ava, if he's not got das for the past, then ein boy das l'she'ava, he shouldn't have das for the future either. Over Rabbi Avudimi, B'chesh Adan Kayamin, we're talking here about a person who's become a deaf mute. Ve'ein shlichus lecheresh. Is there a custom the cheresh can't appoint an agent? Although Rishon Gamliel says a pikeach who became a cheresh can write, will rely on his writing, he agrees he can't command others. So if he's done it, he's done it. That's fine. But he can't write for others to do it because he can't appoint a shliach. This we would. He said, but no, we're talking about someone who's healthy. And he writes to the scribe and the Eidim, they should write get. But lama ain't get. Why does the Brisa say it's not get? Because on the Omer I say, he didn't really have an intention for it to be written. He was just busy with his documents. He writes himself a little note. He had no intention to command that they should fulfill his words. And that we have a worry with a healthy person. He can speak, and yet he didn't speak. We're worried he didn't have intention to give a get. If he's a pikeach who became a deaf mute and he can't speak, which is what Rishon Gamliel is talking about, then you don't have to worry. So it could be that Brisa is not actually arguing on Rishon Gamliel. Okay? We will stop here, Rabbi Isaac.